Hey everyone, and welcome to the FLATLINING Podcast from Fulcrum Strategies. I'm Matthew Handley, and with me is our President and CEO, Ron Howrigon. Ron, how are you, sir?
I am good, thank you. I hope you are as well.
I am doing well. I hope you had a good Easter holiday. I hope everyone listening had a good Easter holiday. We talked previously about changes to the Medicare physician fee schedule and how that's adjusting going forward. And Ron, I think it's important to note because I've had questions from clients, I know you have had questions from clients, that the new fee schedule that is published is perhaps mislabeled on the Medicare website as as the first revision rather than the second revision. So if you're looking for the Medicare fee schedule, it is up there, but it appears to be mislabeled. Am I explaining that correctly, you think?
Yeah, they in the past, whenever they've had two fee schedules in the same year, they label one fee schedule A and the other fee schedule B. They've labeled this one AB, which means that it should be retroactive to January 1st, but it's not. It's retroactive to March 9th. And so they just overlaid the previous schedule. So the long and short of it is you can see the reimbursement rate for current services, but if somebody wanted to go back and look and say, well, how much should I have gotten paid for a service I provided in January? That's no longer there. Yeah. They overrode it.
Yep. Leave it to the federal government to make things more difficult in our lives. But if you need that fee schedule so you can update your billing systems or your billing company needs it, it is there. It's just not labeled correctly. And they appear to not make an announcement that it was up as well. But it is out there on the Medicare website. So I want to make that announcement. The next thing I want to talk about is also related to Medicare, Ron, and this has to do with the Medicare Advantage rates for 2025. The agency published its final rate notice for 2025. That final rule is largely similar to the proposed payment rates issued in January, and the agency will cut benchmark payments by 0.16% from this year to next year. If I recall correctly, we had talked about this a couple weeks ago. A number of the payer lobbies were not happy about this. They thought they weren't going to be paid enough. So talk to me a little bit about what this means, what the Medicare Advantage rates are, and how that's going to affect other payments.
Yeah, so the way that Medicare Advantage plans get paid by Medicare is incredibly convoluted and complex. And so without getting too much into the weeds, it's not a simple, you get X dollars for every Medicare enrollee. There's factors that include star rating, risk score. There's the overall benchmark payment. And so there's all these adjustments. And I think it was made complex because the payers realized that was a great way to get a little bit more money. And so, yes, CMS has come out. They're going to have a 0.16% reduction in the benchmark payments from 25 to 24 over 24. And, the payers came out and just, you would think that, that somebody was stealing the food off their table with their comments. And they, there's a lot of talk about, well, we're going to have to take away benefits from these seniors. And this isn't, this doesn't cover the rapidly increasing cost. And, the long and short of this is a little bit like, Jeff Bezos complaining about the cost of jet fuel for his private jet.
Right.
It's hard for the rest of us to get really upset about this. And the reason why I relay it that way is Medicare Advantage on a per enrollee basis is the most profitable enrollee an insurance company can have, and not by a little bit. It's more than twice the profit per enrollee as any other type of member. That's employer group covered, that's the individual market for the exchange plans, and that's Medicaid. And actually what people most don't understand is the second most profitable is Medicaid. Mm-hmm. So Medicare and Medicaid are much more profitable than the others, and Medicare is more than twice the profit level per enrollee. So from one perspective, one could argue the government's not a very good purchaser of healthcare. But to see these plans complain about something that is going down a little bit, and especially when I compare that to physicians who take cut after cut, and they're not taking a cut on their most profitable patient. They're taking a cut on their least profitable patient. Mm-hmm. So, part of me was like, look, I'm not going to shed too many tears for these plans. And I find a lot of their objections a little bit disingenuous.
Yeah, it's interesting. to talk about the profitability of this, and we've discussed this before on this podcast. It's one of the reasons Humana was getting completely out of the commercial line of business because it was more profitable to focus on their government lines of business, including Medicare and Medicaid. Bloomberg reported that on the news of this on April 1st, share prices fell more than 4% for several of these major insurers, including United Healthcare and Aetna CVS. Now, you talked about the insurance companies are complaining that this will put that they're going to lower benefits and raise premiums. It appears that CVS Health CEO Karen Lynch, she said in a share call on February 7th that it was about what they were expecting based off the initial report. Do you think that the payers, given that they so many of them make such a huge amount of profit every year, do you think that they will raise premiums or cost sharing requirements or lower benefits as a result of this? Or is that a lot of talk just to make the Biden administration look bad?
To be honest, I think it's a little bit of both. Okay. So part of it is absolutely, a scare tactic or to make the administration look bad because, hey, where do we hit them? Where it hurts with registered voters, especially this being election year. So, being able to say, oh, these poor seniors are going to have to pay more is a great thing to do. Now, that being said, their share prices went down because what was obscenely profitable is only mildly obscenely profitable, and Wall Street doesn't like that. And so the way to counter that is to get it back to obscenely profitable by increasing the revenue, and that's by charging more. So I think you'll see some of both. I don't think it'll be this massive increase in premiums or this massive reduction in benefits. I think there will be some of that to try to solve their Wall Street problem. And I think the other parts of it were political pressure. And I know they know that it's going to happen this year, but it's partly political pressure to say, well, don't do this again.
Let me ask you about this too, and how this might affect things. The CMS announced in a news release around the same time that they published this final rule that they're continuing to shift from ICD-9 codes to ICD-10. What does that mean, and will that affect payment for Medicare patients?
Well, so the shift from ICD-9 to ICD-10 is largely to get more detail in the diagnosis codes because there's more of them and it gets down to finer level. Some of them are kind of humorous on how level of detail they get, dog bite left hand, has its own code or whatever. And so, but their feeling is if they get to more detail, that will help them more accurately identify these risk scores, which risk scores are a way that, carriers can get more money. To be honest with you, I think this whole thing, whether it's ICD-9 or ICD-10 is much ado about nothing. There's really not going to be much move on there, but it sounds good. Yeah.
We'll have a link to an article in Becker's Payer Issues about this, including some reaction from some of the payers and some of their lobby groups. I'll also include the Bloomberg report about the share prices falling on this news. I want to move to something else now, Ron, as we kind of do a taster of some of the healthcare news items working their way through right now. We know that there are several lawsuits facing some of the insurance companies out there. We talked before about Cigna's use of their auto denial system. There's a lawsuit about that. There's also there was one about United Healthcare. Now I'm blanking on what that was, Ron.
Well, there's a few about United Healthcare. Yeah. I mean, there's lawsuits around some of their denial stuff. There's lawsuits around, obviously the DOJ investigation for antitrust. So there's at any one time, there's multiple lawsuits against United Healthcare. And again, they may be innocent of all of them. Just because you're getting sued doesn't mean you're guilty. But in a lot of cases where there's enough smoke, there's probably some fire somewhere.
Sure. There's also this one, which has to do with BlueCross BlueShield, and it's one that's taken over a decade to resolve. This is the story from Becker's Payer Issues. Home Depot, the national retail chain, has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to consider its challenge to a $2.6 billion settlement with BlueCross BlueShield companies following a decade-long legal battle over alleged anti-competitive behavior. Home Depot is appealing a decision from October of last year, which upheld a settlement agreement that the two companies reached in 2022. And As part of that agreement, BlueCross BlueShield agreed to drop an association rule that required 2/3 of national net revenues from health plans and related services to come from Blue branded products. Now, before everyone's eyes, gloss over as we're talking about this, let's back up a little bit and talk about the BlueCross BlueShield Association and kind of how they're franchises, for lack of a better term. What were some of these requirements that Home Depot is challenging?
So you're right. The BlueCross BlueShield Association sells or controls basically franchises because they control the name and the marketing, the logos, et cetera. So they allow plans to operate in certain geographic areas. BlueCross BlueShield of North Carolina, for example, has the exclusive rights to the BlueCross BlueShield name and logo for the state of North Carolina. BlueCross BlueShield of Georgia has the rights for Georgia, et cetera. There's also other provisions in there like a franchisee would have. So, for example, if you have a Subway sandwich shop, part of your agreement with the franchise is you're not going to sell Pizza Hut pizza out of your shop. Mm-hmm. You're not going to do other things. So there were provisions in there that limit what these plans can do. And without getting too deep in the weeds about the 3/4 of this or that, basically what Home Depot was challenging us to say that's anti-competitive behavior. And that hurts us because we want to be able to have Blue Cross entities compete with other Blue Cross entities, and you're getting rid of that competition. Now, to me, the insanity of all this, and it really, to me, points out just how bad some of this stuff is on the payer world. Think about this for a minute. Home Depot won an award for $2.6 billion, and they don't like it. Mm-hmm. I mean, you got to wrap your mind around that. A company won an award that would give them $2.7 billion, and they said, wait a minute, we're getting screwed on that. That's not what we want at all. And what they want is for Blue Cross Blue Shield to stop this what they say is anti-competitive behavior and compete, which tells you that the competition part of it, Home Depot believes, is a much greater benefit than getting $2.7 billion. Yeah. And I think they're right. It is much better. Talk to me about that. What's is it anti-competitive? Do you think? I think in the purest form of sort of anti-competitive behavior, it is. Okay. And the reason, and I'll use the Subway example, and I'm not an antitrust attorney, and I'm sure there's attorneys that would argue that I'm wrong on this, and that's fine, is Subway sells territories. Okay. And they say, okay, well, you're going to be the only shop within this much, or, in a big city, well, there will only be this many of these. And the fact that, in a Subway shop, you can't sell Pizza Hut pizza doesn't mean there can't be a Pizza Hut pizza right next to you. Okay. But when you think about things like that, go, well, do I really want a Subway to compete with a Subway in another state? Because I don't go to that. I'm not driving to another state to get a sandwich. Mm-hmm. And that competition really isn't going to change their price because they really don't compete on price. When it comes to health insurance, which is something that, can operate across state lines, et cetera, because it's not, that's not the issue. I would like more competition. And what we know is that health insurance markets are largely uncompetitive. And I'm going to try not to get too much in the weeds here, but one of the things that the government looks at to look at a competitive or uncompetitive market is what's called the HH index. It's a mathematical formula for market concentration. I saw some data recently about states and what their HH index is, and it's a thing where the highest number you can get is 10,000. Okay. And that's would be if there was only one company. Okay. And the way they look at it is they say anything under a score of under 1,000 means it's very competitive. Anything with a score over 2,500 is uncompetitive, and there's a potential problem. Okay. Mm-hmm. I believe Alabama is the most consolidated state. Its HH index score is almost 9,000. Wow. Okay. I think the 10th most consolidated state still has an HH score of like 4,000, which makes it massively uncompetitive, but that's the environment. So I think Home Depot is right They would rather have all this stuff eliminated so they did have to compete than get a couple of $1 billion. And I also think that's why Blue Cross didn't challenge the award, because they're like, hell yeah, we'll pay a couple of billion to keep doing what we're doing. Mm-hmm. That's the insanity of all this, is that you've got a $2 billion, almost $3 billion award, and the winner went, no, that's not nearly enough.
Yeah. And as an aside, if I recall from looking at that report not too long ago, a couple of years ago now, I think, Michigan was pretty far up there too, with most of the state's patients being on Blue Cross Blue Shield or Blue Care Network. Now, what would happen? How would the landscape change if Home Depot got what they wanted? You know, what would change about the healthcare landscape for patients, and how would it change for providers?
So for patients, as far as the delivery of care and stuff like that, I don't think it changes much, okay, because healthcare is local. Now, what could change is if Home Depot is able to get more bidders, if you will, on their business, especially since their business is national in scope and they're covering multiple states, they could potentially get lower cost insurance, because what they want to say is, hey, you know, Blue Cross of North Carolina, I want you to compete with Blue Cross of Tennessee, and I want you to compete with this, and and get to the lowest bidder. What competition is designed to do is produce the lowest cost, most value. If that happens, then either the patients could benefit because maybe they don't have to pay as much to help cover the cost of their insurance, or Home Depot may be making more profit and could, afford to pay their folks better. So the whole point of competition is that it's good for the consumer. And that's what I think they're pushing for. Now, does it change the way the doctor provides you care? Really, probably not. It may change the price you pay for it.
Right. So the way it works now, just so I'm just make sure I'm understanding, so that if I understand, hopefully our listeners can understand. The way it works now is a company like Home Depot, if they're headquartered in whatever state they're headquartered in, are they required to purchase the Blue Cross plan in that state? Or is it, and what they're arguing for is what you just explained, that they want to be able to purchase it in any of the states that they have locations in?
Well, so and this starts to get a little bit
Sure.
So one of the things that the Blue Cross Association allows you to do, and we see this, and I'll give a perfect example, is a plan called Care First. Okay, Care First is an HMO in Maryland that really is owned by the Blue Cross plan of Maryland. Now, they can't call it Blue Cross HMO because that's the name, but they own and operate a separate HMO that can have separate rates, et cetera, as long as they call it Care First. And every Blue Cross plan can do that. When I worked for the Capital Blue Cross in Pennsylvania, we had a HMO called Keystone. Okay. Mm-hmm. What was really getting at this is part of that Blue Cross Association required that 2/3 of national net revenues from these health plans be from Blue branded products, which means I couldn't go after somebody like a Home Depot with my self-branded product, my Keystone or my Care First, because that has to come under that Blue. That's what drives out that competition, is I can't do it the way in my other plan here, because they're saying, no, 2/3 of that revenue. And these big companies would drive an awful lot of revenue. And that's really what they were going after, is saying, no, I want Blue Cross of Michigan to have their own homegrown plan, and I want it to compete with the national Blues plans, because they might then offer me a better product at a lower price. A
lot of that is in the weeds, but we will have the report for you linked in the show notes as well on this report about Home Depot. Well, let me ask you this before we transfer away. Mm-hmm. How significant is it, do you think, that Home Depot is trying to take this to the Supreme Court? Is that a big deal, or does this happen more often than people realize?
Well, I think it's a big deal, and part of this is going to play into a little bit of the the DOJ investigation into United, because up until recently, health plans have been largely insulated from antitrust violations. And so part of what they're saying to the Supreme Court is now, hey, this settlement, at the time it was done, was probably only because the courts didn't feel like we could pursue antitrust, but now we can. And so we want you to set aside the settlement and go back after the antitrust, because one of the things antitrust does is it allows for the courts to say, I'm not just going to award damages, I'm going to break you up, or I'm going to make you do something else. And that's really what they're wanting the court to do, is to make Blue Cross do something else or change the way they do business rather than just pay a fine.
Right.
So it's significant.
We'll have this linked in the show notes for the program and at flatlining.net. You're listening to the Flatlining Podcast from Fulcrum Strategies. I'm Matthew Handley. We'll have more when we come back right after this. Welcome back to the Flatlining Podcast. I'm Matthew Handley here with Ron Howrigon, the president and CEO of Fulcrum Strategies. Ron, the last thing I want to talk to you is a gold carding bill in Kentucky that was trying to go off after prior authorization. It was known as House Bill 317, and what it did was it would have allowed providers with a 90% or higher prior authorization approval rate over a period of 6 months to bypass that process for certain procedures. According to analysis from the Winchester Sun newspaper, it applied to about 450,000 individuals with state-regulated health plans there in Kentucky. How common are these gold carding policies or bills that we might have here in the country to go after prior authorization?
So there's a whole slew of state bills that are trying to go after prior authorization in various forms. Some of them have requirements for how quickly you've got to get back to the recipient. Some of them have requirements for how you can do prior auths. Others, like this, have a requirement for gold carding. And I think these are largely coming from some of the national stories about things like auto denials, stuff like that. They're coming from, some of the black eyes that payers have got about this whole process and what they're doing. So the bills are pretty common. Now, the wins are probably not going to be as common. And what we saw here is the insurance lobby probably spent a fair amount of money and was successful at getting a bill killed, because you've got, the Kentucky Hospital Association wanted it, the Kentucky Medical Association wanted it, and lo and behold, no surprise to anybody, the Kentucky Association of Health Plans did not want it, and they won.
Right.
Now, what's interesting to me is, yes, it would have only applied to fully insured state plans, so it's not everybody. But the payers sort of think about, boy, if too many of the states pass this, we might get a federal bill. The other thing that was interesting here is the 90% level, which I'm sure caused the health plans enormous amounts of panic, because pretty much everybody is better than 90%.
Right.
When you talk about prior auth, I don't know of a single client I've talked to that goes, you know what, we failed 20% of the time. It's usually, we almost always get approved. We just have to jump through these hoops, which is the point of the whole thing.
Yep.
Is to make it hard. Well, any provider who does this on a regular basis, they would have cleared that 90% easily, which would have meant there would have been almost no prior authorization, which should tell you that, well, gosh, if somebody's passing the test at 90% of the time, is the test worth it?
Right.
Because it chews up a lot of money on both sides for stuff that doesn't get associated with healthcare. Now, what the payers will say, and they're probably right to some degree on this, to be intellectually honest, I've got to give them due, is that the fact of having the prior authorization probably keeps some providers from ordering stuff that really isn't medically necessary, because they go, well, this will never get through. It's a little bit like, if the police officer always sits on that road and looks for speeding tickets, you're not going to speed through there.
Right.
So then they probably got some justification for that. But I would imagine that this just scared the hell out of them, going 90%. Everybody clears 90%, which is why they got it killed.
And to their credit, nationally, some of the insurers say that the gold card programs, as these are being called, are administratively difficult to implement. They also claim that they reduce quality and patient safety. And of course, they lead to higher costs, because if you're allowing more procedures to be done, inevitably you're going to have to pay more money for that. I know when you did that story with ProPublica several months ago, because that was all about well, there was some of it was about prior authorization. Yeah. The Cigna story was in particular more about prior authorization. How many, with the prior authorizations, speaking nationally here, not just about Kentucky, do you remember off the top of your head about how many of them get denied?
So the last statistics that I've seen is that the actual denials of prior auths, I think, were less than 3%.
Okay. And of those 3%, for those that get appealed, how many of the appealed ones get through?
Oh, the vast majority of the appeals make it through.
Right.
If you go through the headache and hassle of,
because I think that speaks a little bit more to the test too of, what's the point of the test if you're just going to pass everyone?
Well, and so, being fair, there's definitely a scenario where you could make the argument that if I let doctors have whatever they want, they're going to order things that aren't medically necessary. They may order it for defensive medicine. They may order it because, well, I'll give you a perfect example. I had a pediatric specialist one time who said, yeah, every now and then I order an MRI on a kid that doesn't need it. And I said, really, why do you do that? He goes, because mom isn't going to sleep until we get that.
Right.
She's freaked out. I can't make her okay. She's going to be panicked. And so, is it a waste of money to help mom sleep at night when I can tell her that kid does not have a tumor? But he said, it doesn't happen often, but every now and then. So you get some of that. You get some of the patients who are just, I'm convinced I have this cancer until you tell me otherwise. But, to be fair, if it was completely carte blanche, there probably would be more of these, and there are probably some that don't get ordered because they know they'd never get through. That being said, that's not the only reason why they do it. They do it to make it difficult. They do it because they know sometimes people just quit. And sometimes people don't order things that really is medically necessary because they don't want to go through the hassle. Now, I would challenge the administratively difficult to implement, because in today's computer systems, just saying that ordering physician is now gold carded and exempted from this process is not difficult.
Yep.
And the quality patient safety, that's a little amorphous, but they could have an argument that there would be some higher cost. What my counter argument would be is that offset by the savings of not having a bunch of people on both ends do a process that doesn't produce results?
Right. I tend to agree. And to that point, I think there are people, patients out there who truly do believe that, I don't go to the doctor because they're just going to do a bunch of tests that I don't need. And as you said, I think, in my experience and with the clients that I've worked with, that is not the vast majority of physicians, because the vast majority of physicians want good patient care. They want their patients to be healthy.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, and we talked about this before, I think we should treat the way physicians order things like with the same principle that we have in our judicial system. You are innocent until proven guilty. The state has an obligation to prove that you are guilty of something. Your default is innocent. The doctor's default should be they're right until the carrier can prove that they're wrong, and it shouldn't be that the doctor has to prove they're right. Mm-hmm. If you just flip that, and the onus was on the payer to gather the proof rather than the provider to justify their ordering, I think this would not be a problem at all.
Yeah.
Because then the payers would only go after this stuff that's truly bogus, and it's out there. Yep. There are bad doctors, there are bad lawyers, there are bad plumbers. Every profession has bad apples, and we should get at them, and I would have no problem with that. But the fact that a physician starts in this order as a default of, well, you don't know what you're talking about, you have to prove to us you do, to me is backwards.
Yeah. Well, Ron, we're going to have to leave it there because we are just about out of time. Thanks for sitting down with me, as always, to talk about these and all these other healthcare issues.
Oh, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Miss an episode of the Flatlining Podcast? Well, now you can read a recap. Just go to flatlining.net and look right there on the homepage every Monday for a written recap on last week's episode.